The soft hum of the starship's engines provided a comforting background noise as I sat in the observatory deck, gazing at the swirling purple nebula outside. 3 years into my assignment as Earth's cultural ambassador to the Celestial Alliance, and I still couldn't shake off the surreal feeling of being the only human among the stars. But it wasn't the breathtaking view of space that occupied my thoughts tonight. It was her. Dr. Lyra, the ship's xenobiologist, stood at the far end of the deck, her silvery skin reflecting the starlight in mesmerizing patterns. Like all members of the Aetherian species, she approached everything with cold, calculated logic. Their society viewed intimate relationships as nothing more than a biological necessity for species continuation. No romance, no passion, no joy, just clinical efficiency. I remember the first time we discussed human relationships during one of our cultural exchange sessions. The way her luminescent eyes widened in confusion when I described Earth concepts like dating, romance, and pleasure-driven intimacy. But what evolutionary advantage does this dating serve? She had asked, genuinely puzzled. If the goal is procreation, why add such inefficient complexity? That conversation sparked something neither of us expected: curiosity. Over the following months, our professional discussions gradually evolved into personal ones. I found myself drawn to her brilliant mind, her subtle expressions of wonder when discovering new aspects of human culture. And though she'd never admit it, I could tell she was fascinated by the way humans approached relationships. The turning point came during the Celestial Alliance's annual scientific conference. Lyra was presenting her research on comparative xenobiology when something unprecedented happened. She stumbled over her words. The always composed Aetherian scientist actually blushed, her skin shifting to a deeper shade of silver when our eyes met across the crowded auditorium. Later that evening, she confessed that her time studying human culture had begun to affect her in ways she couldn't explain. She found herself experiencing what she termed irregular emotional responses: butterflies in her stomach when we worked together, distraction when thinking about our conversations, and an inexplicable desire to spend more time understanding human perspectives on intimacy. Your species' approach to relationships defies logical analysis, she had said, her voice carrying a hint of frustration. Yet I find myself wanting to understand it, not just academically, but... She had trailed off, unable to find the right words, a first for her. That's what brought us here tonight, to the observatory deck. After months of dancing around the growing tension between us, Lyra had asked me to explain how humans know when they've developed feelings for someone, how they navigate the complexity of emotional and physical attraction. As I watched her standing there, silhouetted against the stars, I realized we were on the verge of something unprecedented. A human and an Aetherian, bridging not just the gap between their species, but between two fundamentally different views on love and intimacy: the logical and the emotional, the clinical and the passionate. She turned to face me, her expression carrying in vulnerability I'd never seen before. "I think," she said softly, "I'm beginning to understand why your species views intimate connections as more than just biological imperatives." Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step toward me. Would you be willing to help me explore these new feelings?" The answer I gave her that night would change everything, not just for us, but for the future of human Aetherian relations. But that's a story for another time. Looking back at that pivotal moment in the observatory, I realize now that my response wasn't just about us. It was about challenging centuries of Aetherian cultural programming. Understanding feelings isn't something that can be studied in a lab, Lyra, I said, taking a careful step toward her. It's something you have to experience. The way her bioluminescent patterns flickered across her skin betrayed her inner turmoil. Aetherians prided themselves on emotional control, yet here was one of their most respected scientists, struggling with feelings she'd been taught to suppress since childhood. But how can something so chaotic be beneficial? She asked, her scientific mind still trying to make sense of it all. Our historical records show that before we embraced logical mate selection, our society was plagued by emotional instability and decreased productivity. I couldn't help but smile at her typical analytical approach. Did those records also measure happiness, joy, the feeling of being truly connected to another being? I watched as she processed these questions, her head tilting slightly, a gesture I'd learned meant she was deeply contemplating something. The ship's artificial day cycle began to dim, simulating evening, casting long shadows across the observatory deck. Lyra moved to one of the viewing panels, her silhouette framed by distant stars. "I've been reviewing human literature," she confessed. "Your species has produced millions of works about love and attraction. At first, I thought they were merely exaggerated fiction, but now—" She turned to face me, her expression more open than I'd ever seen it. "Now I find myself experiencing physical symptoms similar to those described in these works. Elevated heart rate, difficulty maintaining focused thought patterns, an inexplicable desire for physical proximity." My own heart rate increased at her words. "Those symptoms sound remarkably human," I said softly. "Indeed." She took another step closer. "My colleagues would say I've been contaminated by human ideals, that I'm allowing primitive impulses to override logical thought." Her voice carried a note of conflict I'd never heard before. "Perhaps they're right. Perhaps this is a form of cultural contamination." I shook my head. "Or perhaps you're discovering something your society forgot long ago, that there's logic in emotion and emotion in logic. They're not mutually exclusive." The space between us seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Lyra raised her hand, hesitating just inches from my face. "I've observed human couples performing various physical contacts as expressions of affection. My research indicates these actions trigger the release of various neurotransmitters associated with pleasure and bonding." "That's a very clinical way of describing a caress," I said, trying to hide my amusement. "Would you?" She paused, gathering courage in a way that seemed so endearingly human. "Would you be willing to help me conduct a practical study of these behaviors?" Before I could respond, the ship's communication system crackled to life. "Dr. Lyra, your presence is required in the Science Division immediately. The High Council is requesting an emergency conference regarding your recent, unconventional research directions." The moment shattered like glass. Lyra's professional mask slipped back into place almost instantly, but not before I caught a glimpse of something that looked remarkably like fear in her eyes. The High Council, the governing body of Aetherian society, was known for their strict enforcement of cultural norms. "I must go," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "But this conversation, it isn't finished." As I watched her hurry from the observatory, her silvery form disappearing into the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The High Council's sudden interest in Lyra's research couldn't be a coincidence. Had someone noticed our growing closeness? Were they worried about the implications of an Aetherian scientist developing emotional attachments? Whatever storm was coming, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Lyra face it alone. After all, she wasn't just exploring human concepts of intimacy anymore. She was challenging the very foundations of Aetherian society. And if there's one thing humans excel at, it's standing up for what we believe in, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. I glanced at my data pad, pulling up everything I could find about the High Council's protocols and regulations. If they wanted to stop whatever was developing between Lyra and me, they'd have to learn another very human trait: determination. The next 3 days aboard the starship felt like walking on eggshells. Lyra was conspicuously absent from our usual meeting spots, and my security clearance for the Science Division had mysteriously been revoked. The few times I caught glimpses of her in the ship's corridors, she was always surrounded by other Aetherian officials, their expressions stern and unreadable. I spent my nights poring over the ship's public archives, searching for any precedent of what might happen when an Aetherian began developing emotional attachments. What I found wasn't encouraging. Cases of emotional deviation were rare but always ended the same way: mandatory reconditioning at their homeworld's emotional purification center. On the 4th day, everything changed. I was in my quarters when my personal communicator lit up with an encrypted message. My heart raced as I recognized Lyra's unique coding signature. The message was brief: "Observatory. 3rd shift. Come alone, please." The hours until third shift felt like years. When I finally made my way to the observatory, the ship's night cycle was in full effect, leaving the corridors dimly lit and eerily quiet. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Lyra's silhouette against the backdrop of stars. "They're sending me back," she said without turning around, her voice carrying an emotion I'd never heard from an Aetherian before: fear. "The High Council has deemed my research potentially destabilizing to societal harmony. They believe my feelings for you are a sign of dangerous cultural contamination." I moved closer, noticing how her usually steady hands trembled slightly. "When?" "Tomorrow. A transport ship is already en route." She finally turned to face me, her silver skin almost pale in the starlight. "They're going to erase everything, aren't they? All these new feelings, these experiences, they'll make me forget." The thought of Lyra being stripped of her emerging emotions, being forced back into the cold, logical mold of traditional Aetherian society, made my blood run cold. "I won't let that happen," I said, the words coming out before I could even think them through. She moved closer, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with anxiety. "You don't understand. Going against the High Council's decisions is considered treason. They could revoke your ambassador status, send you back to Earth." "Let them try," I interrupted, reaching for her hand. To my surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with mine, sending a slight electric tingle through my skin. A unique characteristic of Aetherian biology I'd never experienced before. "I've been analyzing my condition," she whispered, her scientific nature emerging even in this emotional moment. "Comparing my symptoms to both human medical records and our own historical documents from before the Great Rationalization. Do you know what I discovered?" I shook my head, mesmerized by the way her skin seemed to shimmer with increasing intensity where our hands touched. "These feelings, love, attraction, emotional bonding, they're not just human traits. They're part of our original nature, something we engineered out of ourselves centuries ago in pursuit of perfect logic." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We didn't evolve beyond emotions. We suppressed them. And now—" A sudden alert blared through the ship's communication system, cutting her off. "Attention all personnel. This is a Class 1 security alert. All sections will be sealed in 5 minutes. Crew members return to assigned quarters immediately." Lyra's eyes widened in panic. "They're here early. The transport ship. It wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow." The observatory's door slid open with a harsh mechanical sound, revealing 3 tall Aetherian officials in the formal robes of the High Council's Enforcement Division. Their stern faces showed no emotion as they stepped into the room, their movements precise and coordinated. "Dr. Lyra," the central figure spoke, his voice as cold as space itself. "Your presence is required for immediate departure. The Council has determined that your condition requires urgent intervention." I stepped forward, placing myself between Lyra and the officials. "You can't just—" "Ambassador," the official cut me off, "this is an internal Aetherian matter. Your interference will be noted in our report to Earth's diplomatic corps." I felt Lyra's hand tighten around mine, her skin temperature dropping rapidly, an Aetherian sign of extreme stress. The next few moments would determine everything: her future, our relationship, and possibly the entire future of human-Aetherian relations. What happened next would change both our worlds forever. But as I stood there, facing down 3 of the most powerful figures in Aetherian society, I realized something crucial. Sometimes the greatest revolutions start with the smallest acts of defiance. The choice we made in that moment would either bridge the gap between our species or widen it into an unbridgeable chasm. And as the enforcement officials took another step forward, I knew there was no going back. The lead enforcement official raised his hand, activating a neural suppression field, standard procedure for transporting emotionally compromised Aetherians. But before the field could fully engage, something unexpected happened. The stars outside the observatory window began to dim, one by one, as if being swallowed by an invisible force. "Security breach in the quantum drive chamber," the ship's eye announced, its usually calm voice carrying a note of urgency. Unknown energy signature detected. All personnel initiate emergency protocols. The enforcement officials exchanged quick glances, their perfect composure slipping for just a moment. This wasn't part of their carefully planned extraction. The lead official's hand wavered, the neural suppression field flickering as his attention split between us and the growing crisis. "The quantum drive's containment field is destabilizing," Lyra said, her scientific expertise cutting through the tension. "If we don't act now, the entire ship could be torn apart at the subatomic level." Her grip on my hand tightened. I'm the only one aboard with enough experience in quantum mechanics to stabilize it. The lead official's face contorted with the first real emotion I'd seen from him: conflict. Their mission was to extract Lyra, but their logical minds couldn't ignore the greater threat to the ship and its crew. It was the perfect embodiment of their society's eternal struggle: protocol versus practicality. "This is clearly a diversionary tactic," one of the other officials declared, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The ship shuddered, as if to emphasize the growing danger. That's when I noticed something in Lyra's expression, a flash of recognition. She understood something about this situation that the rest of us didn't. Before I could question it, she spoke up, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "Council members, I invoke Article 47 of the Aetherian Scientific Charter," she announced. "In cases of immediate technological threat to life, all other protocols are superseded by the requirement to preserve sentient existence." Her luminescent patterns pulsed with determination. "You can either arrest me now and doom everyone aboard, or allow me to do my duty as the ship's lead scientist." The officials hesitated, their rigid adherence to protocol warring with the undeniable logic of her argument. Another violent shudder ran through the ship, and warning lights began flashing throughout the observatory. "Very well," the lead official finally conceded, "but we will accompany you to the drive chamber." As we hurried through the corridors, Lyra's hand still firmly in mine, she leaned close and whispered something that made my heart race. "The quantum fluctuation. It's not random. It's identical to theoretical models I developed months ago, models that could disrupt the emotional suppression technology used in reconditioning." Suddenly, I understood. Someone else aboard this ship had been watching, waiting, and had chosen this moment to act. Lyra wasn't the only Aetherian questioning their society's rigid emotional control. We reached the quantum drive chamber to find it bathed in swirling patterns of energy that shouldn't have been possible according to known physics. The enforcement officials hung back, their training useless against this unprecedented phenomenon. Lyra stepped forward, her scientific mind already analyzing the patterns. But as she reached for the control panel, she hesitated and turned to me. "Whatever happens next," she said softly, "remember that you taught me something more valuable than all my years of research, that the heart has its own logic." The chamber's doors suddenly sealed behind us, locking the enforcement officials out. On the main screen, a message appeared that made both our hearts stop. "Dr. Lyra, your research on human emotional expression has not gone unnoticed. The movement awaits your decision." The movement. I'd heard whispers about them. An underground group of Aetherians who believed their society's emotional suppression was leading them toward cultural stagnation. Until now, they'd been considered nothing more than an urban legend. Lyra's hands flew over the control panel, her movements sure despite the chaos around us. "They're offering us a choice," she said, her voice barely audible over the humming of the destabilized drive. "But taking it would mean no going back. Ever." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time. But I noticed something odd. The areas where we stood remained perfectly stable, while the corridor outside was in chaos. This wasn't just a malfunction. It was a carefully orchestrated opportunity. Through the chamber's window, I could see the enforcement officials frantically trying to override the door controls. We had minutes, maybe seconds, to decide. The path ahead was uncertain, possibly dangerous, but the alternative was watching Lyra be stripped of everything that made her unique: her curiosity, her growing capacity for emotion, her ability to love. As red warning lights painted the chamber in crimson hues, Lyra turned to me, her silver skin glowing with an intensity I'd never seen before. The next words she spoke would set us on a course that would either change Aetherian society forever or mark us as fugitives from the most powerful civilization in known space. And somewhere in the ship, hidden members of the movement waited to see if their risk would pay off, if one human's influence on a single Aetherian scientist could spark a revolution centuries in the making. Lyra's fingers danced across the quantum drive's control panel, her movements precise despite the chaos erupting around us. The movement has created a quantum tunnel, she explained, her voice steady but charged with excitement. If we accept their offer, we'll be transported to their hidden sanctuary among the outer colonies. If we refuse, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The enforcement officials outside had brought in heavy cutting equipment. The doors wouldn't hold much longer. Through the chamber's window, I could see their determination to maintain the order they'd preserved for centuries, even as their world began to crack around the edges. "There's something else you need to know," Lyra said, turning to face me fully. "My research these past months wasn't just about understanding human emotions. I discovered that the Aetherian capacity for emotional connection was never truly eliminated. It was just buried beneath layers of genetic suppression. And the more time I spent with you, the more those suppressions began to break down." A shower of sparks erupted from the door as the cutting beam pierced through. We had moments at most. "The movement believes I've proven their theory," she continued, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with intensity. "That prolonged exposure to genuine human emotion can reawaken our species' capacity to feel. They want to use my research to help others break free from emotional conditioning." The ship's AI blared another warning. "Quantum containment breach imminent. All personnel evacuate immediately." I looked at Lyra, this remarkable being who had dared to challenge centuries of cultural programming for the chance to experience something real. "Whatever you decide," I said, "I'm with you." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw something that would have been impossible just months ago. Tears. Aetherians weren't supposed to be capable of crying. She pressed her palm against the quantum drive's final activation sequence, but before she could complete it, the chamber filled with a blinding light. The enforcement officials had breached the door. What happened next occurred so fast it seemed like a blur. The lead official raised his neural suppressor, but instead of pointing it at Lyra, he turned and disabled his two companions. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Quickly, he said, his formal facade cracking to reveal intense emotion. "I've been part of the movement for decades, waiting for a moment like this." He hurried to the control panel. "Your research, Dr. Lyra, it's the proof we've needed. There are thousands of us throughout the Celestial Alliance, silently waiting, feeling in secret." The ship shuddered more violently as the quantum tunnel began to form. But something was wrong. The energy readings were fluctuating wildly. "The tunnel can only transport two," the official said grimly. "The power requirements. I'll have to stay behind and maintain the field long enough for you to escape. The movement will protect you both." Before we could protest, he began the final sequence. "Go," he commanded. "Show our people there's another way to live. Show them what we sacrificed wasn't worth the cost." Lyra grabbed my hand, her skin practically glowing with emotion. The quantum tunnel crystallized before us, a swirling vortex of possibility. Behind us, the official worked frantically at the controls, buying us precious seconds as more security forces converged on the chamber. We stepped into the tunnel together, but at the last moment, Lyra pulled something from her pocket, a small data crystal. She tossed it to the official. "The full results of my research," she called out. "Share it with everyone." The tunnel's energy enveloped us just as the chamber erupted into chaos. The last thing I saw was the official smiling, the first true Aetherian smile I'd ever witnessed besides Lyra's. We emerged from a small outpost station orbiting a distant moon. Representatives of the movement were waiting for us, their normally controlled Aetherian features openly displaying joy, anxiety, fear, and hope. But they weren't alone. To my astonishment, there were humans among them. Other cultural ambassadors who had formed their own deep connections with Aetherians. We weren't an isolated incident. We were part of a growing wave of change. Lyra squeezed my hand, her silver skin shimmering with a rainbow of emotions she was only beginning to understand. "You know what this means," she said softly. "The High Council will respond. They'll try to suppress this knowledge, hunt us down, maintain their version of order." I pulled her close, feeling the slight electric tingle of her skin against mine. Let them try. Some things are worth fighting for. She leaned into my embrace, her voice carrying both wonder and determination. "We've started something that can't be stopped, haven't we? A revolution of the heart." "No," I corrected her gently. "We've simply reminded your people of something they never truly forgot. That logic without emotion is like a star without light. Beautiful in theory, but cold and dark in reality." As we stood there, surrounded by others who had made the same choice, alerts began pouring in from across Aetherian space. The data crystal Lyra had tossed to the official was already spreading, awakening questions and desires long suppressed. The High Council's perfect order was about to face its greatest challenge, not from weapons or politics, but from the simple, unstoppable power of love. But even as we celebrated our escape, none of us noticed the strange readings coming from the quantum tunnel's residual energy signature, readings that suggested something unprecedented had occurred during our transport. Something that would soon force both humans and Aetherians to question everything they thought they knew about emotional connections and the very nature of consciousness itself. 6 months have passed since our dramatic escape from the starship. The movement's sanctuary has grown into a thriving community of emotional awakened Aetherians and their human partners. What started as a hidden refuge has become a beacon of hope for those seeking to bridge the gap between logic and emotion. The strange quantum readings from our transport turned out to be more significant than anyone could have imagined. The intense emotional connection between Lyra and me had somehow affected the quantum tunnel's properties, creating what Aetherian scientists now call an emotional resonance field. When two beings share a deep enough bond, they can actually influence the fundamental forces of the universe, a discovery that has shaken the foundations of both human and Aetherian scientific understanding. Lyra leads the research team studying this phenomenon, her own emotional growth paralleling her scientific discoveries. "It seems the universe itself favors connection over isolation," she told me recently, her silver skin shimmering with the joy she no longer tries to hide. "Our ancestors thought they were evolving beyond emotion, but they were actually moving against the natural order." The High Council's response to the spread of emotional awakening has been surprisingly muted. The data crystal containing Lyra's research spread too quickly to contain, sparked too many questions to suppress. More Aetherians arrive at the sanctuary each day, drawn by the promise of experiencing life's full spectrum of feelings. But it's not just Aetherians who are changing. Humans living in the sanctuary have learned valuable lessons about balancing emotion with logic, passion with reason. The exchange goes both ways, creating something entirely new, a hybrid culture that takes the best from both worlds. Last week, we held the first official celebration of what the community calls Awakening Day. I watched as Lyra danced under the light of 3 moons, her movements expressing joy in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. The former enforcement official who helped us escape was there too, now one of the sanctuary's most passionate advocates for emotional freedom. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyra asked me that night as we sat watching the star-filled sky. "Giving up your position, your life on Earth, everything you knew." I took her hand, feeling the familiar electric tingle of her skin against mine. "How can I regret something that led to all this? We're not just changing individual lives. We're helping reshape the relationship between 2 species." She smiled, an expression that once would have been considered a sign of dangerous emotional contamination. "The High Council was right about one thing," she said softly. "Emotions are contagious, but they were wrong about that being a weakness. It's our greatest strength." As I write this account of our journey, more reports arrive daily of Aetherians across the galaxy beginning to question their society's emotional suppression. The revolution we sparked continues to spread, not through force or violence, but through the simple power of allowing oneself to feel. Lyra and I still have much to learn from each other. Every day brings new discoveries, both scientific and emotional. But one thing has become clear: Love isn't just a human construct or a biological imperative. It's a force as fundamental as gravity, capable of bridging the gaps between species, between logic and emotion, between what we are and what we can become. The stars shine differently now and we look up at them together. They're no longer just burning balls of gas or navigational markers. They're reminders that in this vast universe, the greatest discoveries come not from suppressing our differences, but from embracing them, learning from them, and allowing them to transform us into something greater than we ever imagined possible.